The city exhaled clouds of smoky gray mist. The streets were soaked, headlights smearing over filthy puddles. Wind shrieked through every crack and crevice, slithering through the gaps in his jacket. The night was cold enough to flay the skin from your bones. The old bus stop creaked and groaned under the weight of the winter wind. Henry stood there, hands buried deep in the pockets of his thin coat. His breath turned to white smoke, vanishing the moment it escaped his lips. Another day over, and nothing to show for it. No job, no rent money, no one waiting for him to come home. Henry quietly lifted his eyes to the traffic streaking down the main street. Headlights, honking horns, people laughing. A whole other world. A world he'd been locked out of a long time ago. The wind screamed again, sharp as a knife across his skin. He hunched his shoulders, pressing closer to the bus stop, trying to catch whatever scraps of warmth he could find. All around him, nameless faces hurried past, no one looking at anyone else, everyone too busy wrestling with their own demons. Henry knew he was nothing more than a ghost in this world. Deep inside, a question echoed without an answer. Who am I anymore? A drunk man staggered past, nearly collapsing into Henry, mumbling a slurred apology. The heavy stench of liquor punched Henry in the nose. The wave of temptation was almost unbearable. A thin sliver of a thought, surrender, flickered through his mind. He wondered how long it had been since he'd truly felt warm. How long since these hands had clutched anything but despair. Across the street, neon light bled from a run-down bar, flickering and luring the lost like moths to a flame. Henry caught a glimpse of the faces inside. They drank, they laughed, they forgot. At least they had something worth forgetting. Henry had nothing. Every step he took on the wet ground felt like another invisible boulder tied to his chest. He thought of the cramped, miserable room waiting for him, a sagging bed, a bare bulb flickering overhead, and silence. A silence so heavy it could choke the life out of you. A semi roared past, blasting its horn and throwing a spray of dirty water up onto the sidewalk. Freezing drops splattered against Henry's pant legs. He didn't even bother to step aside. He just stood there, part of the filthy concrete itself. And then, through the icy drizzle, he saw her, a frail figure, shivering beneath a crumbling awning. She wore nothing but a thin dress, bare shoulders trembling violently in the wind. Henry hesitated. He'd never been anyone's hero, never saved anyone, not even himself. But those eyes were the same ones he'd seen staring back at him in the mirror every morning. Hollow eyes, like the soul had long since packed up and left. A group of teenagers strutted by, snickering when they caught sight of her. One of them tossed out a filthy comment. Henry clenched his fists tighter inside his pockets. He knew he couldn't fix the whole world, but maybe, just this once, just this one time, he could do something different. The wind slapped him again, harder this time. The rain thickened, hammering down like nails. Henry could feel each freezing drop slicing through his thin coat. Slowly he moved toward the girl. Every step felt like it weighed a ton. She looked up at him, eyes swollen red from cold and crying. No words, just that look. Henry stopped right in front of her. He shrugged off his coat, a simple act, but for Henry it felt like stripping off the last layer of armor he had left. He draped the coat around her shaking shoulders. She stared at him, wide-eyed. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. Henry had no idea what to say. He just gave a small nod and turned away. He didn't expect a thank you, didn't expect to be remembered. He only knew that if he hadn't done it, he wouldn't be able to live with himself. The wind howled even harder. The rain came down in sheets. Henry stumbled back toward the bus stop. His shirt was soaked through, plastered cold against his skin, frozen to the bone, but somewhere deep inside a tiny fire had sparked to life. For the first time in months, he felt human again, truly human. Henry stood beneath the cramped shelter. The rain needled through his soaked clothes like 1,000 icy pins. He shivered uncontrollably, but he didn't care. All he could see in his mind was the small girl, clutching the coat he'd given her. She had sunk down onto the steps, wrapping the jacket around herself like a fragile talisman. Part of Henry wanted to go back, to ask her name, to make sure she was okay, but the other part, the weak, scared part, dragged him backward. The last bus rumbled up, engine growling in the cold night. Henry climbed aboard. The doors hissed shut behind him with a cold, final thud. He slid into the back row, pressing his forehead against the icy window. Raindrops streaked the glass, distorting the streetlights into broken, wandering smears of gold and white. Henry closed his eyes. He tried to chase away the emptiness hollowing out his chest. He tried to forget those desperate eyes. The bus rocked and rattled through the empty streets. Outside, the city wasn't living, just surviving in the biting cold. Henry wondered where the girl would go, if she would find someplace warm enough to make it through the night, or if she'd stay right there till dawn, huddled in a tattered coat, swallowed whole by loneliness. He pictured her curled up in a corner, trying to disappear behind cold wooden beams, her eyes flickering between pain and the last gasps of hope. The bus screeched to a stop at the last station. Henry dragged himself off. The streets were deserted, nothing but the winds howling and the steady drumming of rain on rooftops. He trudged back toward his rented room, head down. His key scraped noisily in the rusty lock. The door creaked open, revealing a room darker and colder than the night outside. Henry didn't bother turning on the light. He dropped down onto the floor, leaning against the wall. Water dripped from his clothes, pooling into little puddles on the cracked linoleum. He hugged his knees, trying to squeeze a little warmth from his own body, but the cold had already burrowed deep into his bones. Henry shut his eyes. In the darkness, he saw the girl's face again. Saw her bony hands clutching his jacket like it was her last lifeline. A droplet slid down his cheek, rain or tears he couldn't tell. He whispered into the empty room, "Hope you're okay." The words were snatched away by the wind the instant they left his lips. Henry didn't know, but in that moment, the moment he'd shrugged off his coat, something had shifted, not out there, in the gray, uncaring world, but inside him. In the silence, a tiny seed of compassion took root, and somehow it was growing, slow but stubborn. He sat there a long time, letting the cold seep deeper and deeper. His eyes stayed closed, but his mind roamed through the dusty hallways of memory. He thought of his mother, of the long-gone days when she was still alive. She'd always told him, "Never turn your back on someone who needs help," but life had beaten that lesson out of him. Until tonight, Henry opened his eyes. The room was pitch black, but deep inside him there was a flicker of light, a fragile glimmer, but light all the same. He pulled himself to his feet. His legs trembled from cold and exhaustion. He rummaged through the clutter until he found an old blanket. He wrapped it around his shaking body, and he made a promise to himself. If he saw that girl again tomorrow, he would do more. Not just a coat, not just a pitying glance. He would do something, whatever it took. Outside, the rain still hammered the world. The wind shrieked through every crack and crevice. But inside Henry, a different kind of storm was building. A storm of long-buried feelings clawing their way back to life, of guilt, of compassion, of a fierce, stubborn resolve. Henry closed his eyes once more. This time, he wasn't searching for sleep. He was searching for strength, the strength not to turn his back on the world ever again. The next morning, Henry woke to the sound of rain drumming steadily against the window. The room was freezing, a thin gray light leaking through the dust-caked glass. He sat for a long while before finally dragging himself out from under the damp, musty blanket. The image of the girl beneath the awning still clung to his mind, sharp and undiminished. He threw on an old wrinkled shirt, and heavy, reluctant steps carried him out the door and back into the unending rain. When he arrived at the bus stop, everything was exactly as it had been. The battered awning, the cracked steps, the swollen puddles. Except the girl was gone. No trace, not even the faintest sign that she had ever been there. Henry stood still as the rain poured down on his back, cold and relentless. A tight ache rose in his throat. He sat slowly on the cracked step, the very one where she had huddled the night before, wrapped in his jacket. He bowed his head, unsure what he had hoped for. A thank you? A second chance encounter? Or maybe just the quiet reassurance that she had made it through the night. A sleek, expensive car pulled up to the curb, but Henry didn't lift his head. He was used to the sharp sting of contrast between his life and the one just beyond reach. Then the door opened. The click of high heels struck the wet pavement with purpose. Henry looked up. A woman stood before him, dressed simply but with unmistakable grace. Her black hair gleamed. Her eyes held a depth he couldn't begin to comprehend. She smiled. Distant, gentle. "Henry?" she asked, voice soft and low. Henry froze. He didn't know her, had never seen her in his life. The woman handed him an envelope. "A gift from an old friend," she said. Before he could respond, she turned away. The heels clicked, the door shut, and the car vanished into the curtain of rain. Henry stared down at the envelope in his hand. It was thick, heavy. One word was written on the outside. "Thank you." His hands shook as he opened it. Inside was a thick stack of cash, more than he had ever held before, and a slip of paper. Not everyone turns their back. Sometimes it only takes a small gesture to save a soul. He sat in stunned silence as the rain continued to hammer the city, but within him, a fire that had only flickered now roared to life. He clutched the envelope tightly. Its warmth seemed to bleed into his frozen fingers. He stood up. His eyes no longer held that sunken, hollow stare. He began walking toward the city center. On his way, he saw weary faces and hunched bodies trying to vanish into the walls. He realized the girl hadn't been the only one. There were hundreds like her, thousands, just like him, forgotten, abandoned. He stopped in front of a small bakery. The windows were fogged from warmth. Fresh loaves lined the cases. He stepped inside, the scent of bread wrapping around him like a hug. He bought a bag full of warm bread, not for himself, and stepped back out. Slowly, one by one, he handed the loaves to the homeless scattered along the sidewalks. Every quiet thank you, every faint smile lit another small fire inside him. An old man took a loaf with teary eyes. "Thank you, son," he rasped. Henry smiled in return. He felt warmer than any jacket had ever made him feel. The rain eased. Sunlight pushed through the thinning clouds in tentative streaks. Henry lifted his face, letting the final raindrops trail down his cheeks. He thought of the girl again, where she might be now. But one thing he knew for certain, no matter how cold or cruel the world might become, if one person dares to reach out, a soul can still be saved. And this time, Henry had chosen. He would be the one who reaches out first. The next day, Henry returned to the old bus stop. No girl, no mysterious woman, just the cracked awning and puddles of dirty water. He sat down on the worn steps, fingers clutching the note tighter, every word searing deeper into his memory. Not everyone turns their back. He watched the steady stream of people rushing past, cold faces, relentless footsteps. He wondered how many of them had ever stopped, how many had ever reached out instead of looking away. Henry stood. He began walking through streets he had once passed like a ghost, but now he saw them. Really saw them. An old woman selling lottery tickets under the drizzle. A man dragging a cart filled with rusted scraps. A small child clutching a frail, shivering dog beneath a crumbling awning. Henry stopped for each one. Shared the little money he had, offered pieces of bread, listened to their stories, broken and full of despair, but also gratitude. He knew he couldn't save the world, but maybe, just maybe, he could pull a few souls from the frozen grip of indifference. He returned to the bakery and bought more this time, a lot more. When the shopkeeper grinned and teased, "Trying to be a superhero again, huh?" Henry simply replied, "No, just trying to be human." On the way back, he spotted a group of teenagers mocking a homeless man. The man clutched a battered suitcase like it was his last possession. Henry stepped between them, said nothing, just stood. The teens sneered, muttered, and walked off. Henry sat beside the man, offering a loaf of bread and a bottle of water. The man looked at him, stunned. "Why?" he asked, voice hoarse. Henry smiled gently. "Because I used to be cold too." Night fell. The city glowed with its sickly yellow lights. Henry remained seated at the corner, beside the old man. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Sometimes, he realized, all it took to warm a soul was for someone to sit with them in the dark. In the days that followed, Henry became a part of the city he once drifted through unseen. He learned every face, every corner. He found out the old lottery seller preferred tea over coffee, learned the junk man had once been a carpenter, discovered the child's name was Max and the dog's name was Daisy. He brought them small gifts, an old blanket, an umbrella, a hot meal, but most of all he brought presence, something no one expected. He didn't hurry. He didn't pity. He just stayed. He listened. He laughed. He cried with them. One evening, while sitting with Max and Daisy, a man in a tailored suit approached, confused. "What are you doing here?" he asked. Henry looked up and smiled. "Living." The man frowned, turned away, and walked off, disappearing into a world that had never really seen people like Henry. But Henry didn't feel anger. He understood. Not everyone was ready to face the truth. And he understood something else. The world wasn't changed by grand speeches. It was changed by small, consistent acts. A piece of bread, a blanket, a handshake, a hug. One night, he found a young girl huddled under a bridge, crying. Rain soaked her to the bone. Henry removed his coat and wrapped it around her, just as he had once done before. Then he sat beside her all night. No questions, no judgment, just quiet presence. When the morning came, the girl reached out and took his hand. Her eyes shimmered with gratitude. Henry smiled, and in that moment he realized something. He had found what he thought he'd lost long ago, himself, and with it a simple, unshakable belief: as long as one hand reaches out, the darkness will never win. The next morning, Henry returned to the old corner of the street. Pale sunlight filtered through a thin veil of mist. The city remained loud, cold, and unforgiving, rushing forward on its relentless breakneck course. Henry sat down on the familiar cracked steps and pulled a worn notebook from his pocket. The leather cover was flaking, and the pages were yellowed and soft at the corners. He began to write. Not a diary, not complaints, just a record of the faces he'd seen. The fleeting, fragile stories, the brief moments when kindness flickered against the dark. He wrote about Max and Daisy, about the old lottery seller with her tea, the former carpenter with his calloused hands. Every page was a quiet reminder. They existed, they mattered, they deserved to be remembered. Henry closed the notebook gently and walked toward the bakery. The shopkeeper greeted him with a familiar smile. "There's my hero," he joked. Henry chuckled. Not a hero, just someone who remembers how to see people. He bought a big bag of bread and a few cups of coffee, which he handed out along the sidewalks. Every smile and nod he received felt like a tiny lantern lighting the road ahead. That afternoon, Henry visited the small West Side Park, a place where the homeless gathered beneath skeletal trees. He laid down a tarp, set out bread, hot tea, and some old clothes he'd collected. He didn't make a speech, didn't preach. He just smiled and welcomed each person. An old man took a jacket with trembling hands. A young mother, her baby bundled tightly, asked quietly for a blanket. Henry listened to each whispered thank you, each hesitant glance, and in their silence he understood. Quiet kindness could carry more power than the loudest speech. That evening, as darkness wrapped the city, Henry wandered the streets. He looked at the neon lights and saw not color, but loneliness. He saw the weight beneath suits and ties. Not only the homeless needed a hand, the proud did too, each hiding their emptiness in different ways. He stopped at a small coffee shop and sat alone with a cold cup. His notebook lay open beside him. He added a new name, no story. A small seed, quietly planted in a city that had once felt lifeless. Henry's eyes no longer held sorrow. Instead, there was a quiet persistence, a light not easily extinguished. He left after nightfall, the wind cutting through the streets like a dull blade. He wrapped his coat tighter and held his notebook close. His steps took him toward the rougher edges of town, where broken lives hid from the world. In a dim corner, he spotted a group of kids gathered around a steel drum fire, scraps of cardboard feeding the flames. Their soot-covered faces glowed in the flickering light. Henry approached slowly, hands raised, showing he meant no harm. He sat down a short distance away, sharing their warmth in silence. A little girl shyly offered him a piece of stale bread. Henry accepted it with reverence, nibbling at it like it was a gift of gold. He told them small stories about a man who once believed he was invisible, about how tiny miracles unfold when someone finally decides to look. The children, cautious at first, slowly edged closer. They laughed. They shared tales of their daily battles, hunting for food, avoiding trouble, watching over each other. Henry listened without judgment, and in their weary eyes he saw resilience many adults had lost. Before leaving, he handed them bread and a few knitted scarves. They shouted with joy. One boy tugged at his sleeve and asked, "Will you come back?" Henry knelt, looking into that hopeful, wide-eyed face. He nodded. "I promise." That night, Henry walked for a long time. Deep within, those small seeds had started to grow, not from grand gestures, but from quiet, consistent acts, a greeting, a smile, a silent presence. And it was those things, one by one, that were slowly mending the cracks in his heart. And maybe, just maybe, they were healing the city's broken heart too. In the days that followed, Henry returned to the old neighborhood again and again. He wasn't a stranger anymore. He had become a part of these streets, a part of the stories no one else cared to tell. One freezing morning, he found Max sitting alone beneath a crumbling awning, crying. Daisy, the little dog who never left his side, was gone. Henry sat beside him, gently placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. Through broken sobs, Max explained. Animal control had taken Daisy away. They said she was filthy. Dangerous. Henry's heart twisted. He pulled Max into a tight hug. A hug that said, "I'm here. We'll find a way, Max. I promise." And Henry kept that promise. He spent the entire day walking from one animal control center to another, bargaining, pleading, explaining. Finally, with what little money he had left and all the sincerity he could muster, he brought Daisy back. When Max hugged the dog, crying with joy, Henry just stepped back, a weary but whole smile on his face. That night, under the pale street lamp glow, Henry sat once more at the bus stop, where it had all begun. Mist floated in the air, the wind bit at his skin. But he didn't feel so alone anymore. He pulled out his notebook and added another name, another story, another seed planted. Across the street he saw a young couple arguing. The man punched a lamppost, furious. The woman cried, her face hidden in her hands. Henry stood. He didn't know if he could help, but he walked toward them anyway. No words, just presence, because sometimes just being seen is enough. He stood there quietly, hands in his coat pockets, gaze calm. The man's shoulders eventually slumped. The woman looked up. Their eyes met Henry's, and then turned back to each other. No thank you, no conversation. But Henry didn't need either. He returned to the familiar corner. Max, Daisy, the old lottery woman, the carpenter, they were all there. They smiled when they saw him, waved. In their eyes, Henry saw himself, not a ghost anymore, not just another cold body on the margins, but someone connected, a thread in a growing web, a family. In the cracks of a glittering city, Henry found a light, not a blinding one, but a quiet, stubborn glow, the kind you only notice if you're willing to stoop low enough to see it. And inside Henry something whispered, sometimes salvation doesn't come from miracles. It comes from ordinary hands, from slow, steady footsteps, from eyes that dare to see pain, and from hearts that refuse to give up, no matter how battered. The next morning, Henry carried an old suitcase filled with donated essentials, warm coats, boots, canned food. He handed them out to friends, old and new, across the neighborhood. Every time he offered a jacket, a pair of boots, or a can of food, he saw something spark in tired eyes, that flicker of stunned gratitude. Max came running to show off his new boots, already scuffed but sturdy and warm. Daisy barked and spun around Henry's legs. One old woman who used to silently accept bread now clutched his hand tightly, her faded eyes brimming. Henry smiled. He didn't need her to speak. That touch said everything. Later that day, Henry built a small shelter with nothing but a tarp and hope. Flimsy, yes, but for someone with nowhere to go, it was a fortress. He laid down a few blankets and taped a sign to the wall. Free shelter, come in if you need. People hesitated, but eventually they came. They sat together in the dim light, telling stories in fragments, sharing wounds they had no words for. And Henry listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer solutions. He simply listened. And in that silence, he reminded them, "You're still human." One night, while tidying up the makeshift blankets, Henry saw a young girl hovering at the edge of the light. Her coat was thin, her face drawn. He stepped toward her gently. "You need a place to sleep?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded. Henry guided her inside, handed her a cup of tea. She took it, her hands trembling. "Thank you," she whispered. Henry just smiled, because he knew sometimes a cup of tea could save a soul. That night, Henry stayed awake, keeping quiet vigil. Outside, the storm raged, but inside that fragile shelter, there was warmth, there was hope. By morning, the girl had vanished, but she'd left behind a folded blanket and a tiny scrap of paper. "Thank you for seeing me." Henry held the note and smiled. He slipped it into his notebook. Another name, another story, another tiny seed. And he knew. Whatever came next, however hard it got, he would not stop, because Henry had chosen, once and for all, to be the light, even if he was only a single, flickering flame in a sea of darkness. Days passed, and Henry became a familiar face in the old neighborhood. People greeted him with shy but sincere smiles, small nods of recognition. The children would come running whenever he showed up with a bag of bread or a bundle of old coats. But Henry knew. Every light had to contend with darkness. One evening, as he was handing out food, Henry spotted a stranger lurking in the shadows. The man wore a torn hoodie, his gaze cold, calculating. Henry smiled and offered him a sandwich and a bottle of water. The man took them without a word. His eyes weren't like the others Henry had seen. Not desperate, not grateful, but angry. Bitter. A chill ran down Henry's spine. That night, while Henry was packing up, he was attacked from behind. A sharp blow to the back of the head sent him sprawling. Footsteps stomped around him. Hands rifled through his things, his bag of bread, his battered suitcase, all of it stolen. When Henry finally drifted back to consciousness, the rain was pouring down in heavy sheets. He lay sprawled on the freezing concrete, blood trickling from a gash on his scalp. Nothing left. Just two empty hands. Henry gritted his teeth and forced himself up. He staggered through the rain. No one noticed. No one stopped. Just like that first night he had found a girl under the old awning. But this time, Henry didn't feel despair, he felt anger. Not anger at the man who had robbed him, but anger at a world that had left men like that with no better choices. He didn't blame them. He blamed a society that had forgotten how to look each other in the eye. Henry returned to his tiny rented room. He cleaned his wound as best he could, using whatever he had left. His hands shook from the cold, from the pain, but his eyes still burned bright. The next morning he returned to the streets. No suitcase, no bread, just himself. The old lottery woman spotted him and ran over, sobbing. The old carpenter gripped his hand tightly. Max pushed a dirty, half-melted lollipop into his palm. "This is for you, Henry." Henry laughed, tears mixing with the rain on his cheeks. He understood now. Love, once planted, doesn't vanish with a single blow. It lives in awkward hugs, in small, clumsy gifts, in grateful looks that need no words. Henry sat back down on the familiar cracked steps, opened his old notebook. His pencil trembled against the damp page. He wrote, "Robbed, knocked down, but not defeated," and he smiled, a real smile. Henry sat there longer than usual. The rain kept falling. Cold water seeped into his clothes, into his skin. But Henry didn't feel cold. Inside, a fire burned. Not a fire of rage, a fire of determination. He thought about the child who had once offered him a scrap of bread, about the old hand that had once squeezed his. Henry knew that if he gave up now, everything he had built would crumble. No, he wouldn't let that happen. The next morning, Henry started over. He knocked on the doors of tiny bakeries, asked for leftover bread. He gathered discarded clothes wherever he could find them, collected dry cardboard for shelter. At first, people looked at him with suspicion, but slowly his patience and quiet sincerity melted a few hearts. One bakery owner began giving him bags of bread every night. An old seamstress sewed up some battered scarves for him. A young man dropped off a bundle of warm socks. Bit by bit, Henry rebuilt his small world, a pocket of warmth in the frozen heart of the city. Max walked beside him every day. Daisy bounded happily at their heels. Other kids started to gather around Henry too. They called him Kind Uncle Henry. Henry didn't need the title. He just needed the smiles, the light shining in dark eyes. One night, while tending a fire under the bridge, Henry heard hurried footsteps. He turned. It was the man in the hoodie. He stood there, breathing hard, looking lost. In his hand, hesitantly, he held a tattered cloth bag. He stepped forward and placed it in front of Henry. No words. Then he turned and vanished into the night. Henry opened the bag. Inside was his old suitcase, and a few squashed but still edible loaves of bread. Henry sat there, stunned. He didn't chase after the man, didn't call out. He just smiled quietly. Some wounds take time to heal. Some lost souls need forgiveness before they can forgive themselves. Henry added another line to his notebook. Forgiveness lights the way, for the broken and the breakers alike, and he believed it. He believed that no matter how hard the road, As long as one person kept walking, the darkness could never swallow the light completely. Henry looked up at the night sky. Through the thick, black clouds, he spotted a tiny star, faint and trembling, but still shining. One day, while Henry was handing out bread to the kids, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The door swung open. A man in a sharp suit stepped out. His gaze was sharp, his face grim. Henry stiffened slightly. The man approached, his polished leather shoes clicking against the gray sidewalk. "Are you Henry?" he asked, his voice low and steady. Henry nodded, wary. The man handed him a business card. Henry took it. It bore only a single name, William Cross. No title, no address, just a phone number. "I've heard about what you're doing," William said, his eyes seeming to cut straight through Henry. "We need people like you." Henry frowned slightly. "We?" William gave a faint smile. "A small group. People who believe kindness shouldn't be a rarity. We help, quietly, no spotlights, no fame." Henry said nothing, listening. William went on. "There are places darker than this neighborhood. People more desperate than the ones you've met. Would you go farther, Henry?" Henry looked around him, the small faces smiling up at him, the frail hands waving. He tightened his grip on the card. Henry knew if he left, he'd be stepping away from everything he'd built. But he also knew, somewhere out there, others were waiting. Other lost souls, other broken hearts, waiting for a hand to reach out. Henry lifted his head. The wind blew past, carrying the scent of smoke, wet stone, and a fragile thread of hope. "I'll go," he said, voice steady. William smiled. He said nothing more, just turned and headed back to the car. Henry watched him go. He knew the road ahead would be harder, colder nights, deeper wounds, but he wasn't afraid, because now he understood. As long as one person lit a tiny spark, darkness would never win. Before leaving, Henry spent another week setting things in order. He found a small room near the neighborhood for the lottery woman, persuaded the old carpenter to take a part-time job at a little repair shop he knew, arranged for Max to start learning his letters at a charity school, found Daisy a new home with a kind-hearted cafe owner. Every step he took felt heavier than the last. He knew he was leaving a piece of his heart behind. On the last night, they held a small party. Just bread, hot tea, and stories. No flowers, no candles. Just smiles and warm, shining eyes. The old lottery woman pressed a tattered handkerchief into Henry's hand. "Take it, so you won't forget us." Henry clutched it tightly. Max threw his arms around him so fiercely that Henry had to gently pry each little finger loose. "You'll come back, right?" Henry nodded softly. "I promise." The next morning, Henry set out. A small backpack slung over his shoulder, carrying all he owned. A few worn clothes, his frayed leather notebook, and the old handkerchief. William was waiting for him at the corner. No greetings, just a silent nod. The black car rolled away, carrying Henry farther and farther from the place that had saved his soul. Henry didn't speak during the ride. He stared out the window, watching unfamiliar streets, unfamiliar faces, unfamiliar stories slip past. And he knew everywhere he went, he would light more tiny sparks, fighting against the dark. One day, no one might remember his name. His face might fade like dust on the road. But that didn't matter. Henry had never done it to be remembered. He did it because he believed. In a world like this, every hand extended, every smile shared, every eye willing to see could save a soul. And that way, the light would never go out. Appreciate you staying with us. Not everyone gets to hear the untold. If this intrigued you, drop a like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe to The Untold Story to uncover even more.